All of us have been living through the greatest disruption of our lifetimes. Nothing has come close to what we've seen coming out of COVID. And I think we're going to rethink and reconsider everything in our lives. But this theme of disruption has been with us for a long time. And I'm really interested in why companies can almost never disrupt themselves. It almost always takes an outsider. In the book industry, it couldn't be Chapters or Dymocks or Barnes and Noble. It had to be Amazon. In the taxi industry, the players themselves couldn't realize their business models were changing. We need to innovate. It had to be Uber. In the automobile industry, although the case could be made clearly for electric vehicles, it couldn't come from General Motors or Jaguar or Volkswagen or Toyota. It had to come from a whole new player. Even during COVID with video conferencing, even though Cisco had WebEx and Microsoft had Teams, the real innovation came from a new player. And that's because the old players rarely can disrupt themselves. They're so successful that they can't change the ways they do business. I was interested in the last couple of years that 4 of the 5 biggest companies in the world were Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple. And what's compelling about those 4 is they're all essentially 20 years old. And with one deliberate mistake, when I say that, Apple actually started in 1976, but I would argue that the Apple of the 20th century never achieved more than 3% market share. The Apple we think of as the global behemoth, the world's biggest company now, didn't actually begin till 2003, 18 years ago, when Steve Jobs introduced the iPod and iTunes, and then 2007 with the iPhone, and 2010 with the iPad. So Apple's really 18 years old. Amazon, a little more than 20, just a couple, but essentially if we round off 20 years. Google, literally 20 years old, and Facebook, about 16 years old. Well, what's striking about that in this theme of disruption is if those 4 companies could come along in 20 years, how could we possibly think there wouldn't be another 3 or 4 that would come along over the next 20 years? And my job is to try to figure out who those companies are. In valuation right now, it's Tesla, but we'll see if they're in it for the long haul. More compelling is the big 4, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple, should have been the big 6. Should have been Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, Xerox, and Kodak. Xerox and Kodak should be thought of today exactly the way we think of Microsoft's one of the top 5 now as well, but the way we think of Amazon or Google. Xerox invented the Ethernet. They invented the laser printer. They invented the graphical user interface and the mouse. Steve Jobs admitted that he visited Xerox PARC, P-A-R-C, which stood for Palo Alto Research Center. Jobs admitted he visited Xerox PARC in the early 80s, saw the graphical user interface and the mouse, saw that Xerox wasn't doing anything with it. They just invented these things. They never marketed them. And he stole it. And from that, he created the Macintosh, and the rest is history. Xerox should be one of the biggest companies in the world. Kodak, the massive world leader in photography, one of the 3 greatest brand names on planet Earth. Everybody could recognize Kodak just from their signature orange and yellow colors. They invented digital photography. They should own digital photography, which is much, much bigger than photography because everyone has a camera. And the average person now, by the time they're 16, has probably taken 100,000 pictures. They should own that, but they were making so much money in traditional photography, selling film, selling processing, that they couldn't pivot. This is one of the problems with disruption is companies look at the old ways that work. The music business. The music business had a business model that was nothing short of extortion. The business model of the music industry was, you like 2 songs, you have to spend $16 or £12 and buy 12 songs if you wanted 2 songs. And the industry, when it saw that that model didn't work, you couldn't make people pay for music they didn't want. As soon as they had a choice, and if they couldn't get a legal choice, they went to the illegal choice, Napster. The industry, rather than saying, we need to reform ourselves, let's appreciate what we had, they went to court and they tried to make their competition illegal. The taxi industry did the same thing with Uber, trying to make their competition illegal. And now in America, the automobile dealers are trying to make it illegal for Tesla to sell their cars directly to consumers. So companies, rather than saying we need to be nimble and innovate and change, and the old ways don't always move forward, they're very resistant, opening the door to a new player. One of my favorite quotes, it's one of those amazing quotes that could have been script written if it wasn't true. In 1999, Bill Gates, the richest man in the world, and he's still right up there, although he's had a bad year, not financially, but Bill Gates, the richest man in the world in 99, was asked, who keeps you awake at night? Is it AOL? Is it Intel? Who makes you nervous? And Gates very arrogantly and dismissively said, I don't even think about those guys. He said, you want to know who keeps me awake at night? This is an amazing quote. Gates himself didn't know what he was saying. He said, you want to know who keeps me awake at night? It's 2 guys in a garage in the Silicon Valley. And what he didn't know was literally, as he was saying that, there were 2 math PhD students at Stanford in a garage in the Silicon Valley, creating a new algorithm for search that did so much to disrupt Microsoft and change the world. So the disruption comes not from big companies and laboratories. It usually comes from 2 guys in a garage. If you ever travel to the Silicon Valley, there are now 3 garages that are historical landmarks. There's the Larry Page, Sergey Brin garage, which was owned by one of the Wojcicki sisters. And incidentally, you can drive by it, but it's still somebody's house. You can't go in. And that's where Google really was created. From the 70s, there's the Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak garage, where the first computers were developed. And that was owned by Steve Jobs' mother. That's also a private home. And then there was a third garage. When I ask audiences, this one's hard to get because it's a lot older, but it's a garage from the Silicon Valley, 2 guys, so far it's always 2 guys whose name is on the company, Hewlett Packard. And the HP garage, it's about 5 miles from where it is now. They moved it onto the HP campus and people can visit it. But Hewlett Packard started in the 30s in a garage when William Hewlett and David Packer got an order for 2 oscilloscopes from a guy in Southern California who started his company in a garage, a guy named Walt Disney. And that was the beginning, but that wasn't a Silicon Valley garage, although it was 2 people again. It was Walt and his brother Roy. but nonetheless, that's a different story and a different industry. So the point of that is there are a lot more garages in the Silicon Valley. There are a lot more garages in China and Israel and the UK. And hopefully the next innovation comes not from two guys in a garage, but two women in a garage or a den or some other part of the house. But this is what's interesting about disruption. Just to review for a second, in 20 years, you have 4 of the 5 biggest companies in the world seemingly coming from nowhere. And in the case of Facebook, from a dorm room at Harvard, with Google out of a garage, with Amazon, a garage in Seattle, Apple out of a garage. But as I said, technically that was the 70s, but they became, you have this innovation that comes from nowhere, dominates the world. But there is no reason to think that those 4 companies will still be 4 of the 5 biggest companies in the world. If they're smart, they won't go the way of Xerox and Kodak. Ironically, Xerox and Kodak were the 2 biggest companies in Rochester, New York. So Rochester, New York should have been the Silicon Valley. We should talk about, we could talk about Israel as the Rochester, New York of the Middle East, except because of Kodak and Xerox, they blew it. So I'm really interested in where disruption comes from, why it's rarely the established player, and it's almost always a new player. And that means the next 20 years are going to be awfully exciting.